Hello and welcome to the Guildford Twinning Association's 2020 Spring Lecture, our first online lecture. Before I introduce our fabulous speaker, a few words about the Guildford Twinning Association. It's a voluntary and non-political association formed 40 years ago to support the signing of a legal agreement between the councils of Guildford in southern England and Freiburg im Breisgau, a beautiful city in southwest Germany. We help the citizens of the two towns to come together and to learn about each other. We help with cultural, social, educational, sporting, tourist exchanges. We support the council's end of the deal, that's the official and commercial relationships. And as part of this, we aim to raise the profile of Freiburg and Germany with the citizens of Guildford. And this lecture is part of that initiative. Now, the Germans just adore Shakespeare, so much so they often forget he's not German. How is this, and why is this? Our speaker's going to explain, and Ben Schofield is just the right man for the job. As a schoolboy, he went on a town twinning educational exchange from his school in Guildford to a school in Freiburg and fell in love with Germany, a twinning success. He studied German and he's now senior lecturer in German literature at King's College London University. His researches cover German theatre practice and the cultural relationship, or love affair, between Germany and Shakespeare. He works with London's Globe Theatre and with King's College's London Shakespeare Centre. Now, Ben, please tell us about the German love affair with Shakespeare.
Well, thank you, Barbara, for the introduction, and to the Guildford Twinning Association for this opportunity to talk about the important role that Shakespeare has played in the twinning of our two cultures. As Barbara has said in her introduction, Germany has had a long love affair with Shakespeare, a love affair at times so intense that it has led people to claim that Shakespeare was actually a German. Indeed, it is really quite common in literary histories of 19th century Germany to hear authors say that they will be telling the story of German culture through examples of the three great German authors, Goethe, Schiller, and, you guessed it, Shakespeare. I want to look in my talk today at this claim, a claim that's seemingly extraordinary to British eyes, and how it has managed to hold such sway. How did it happen? How did this idea of Shakespeare as a German develop? And also I want to think about the extent to which it has managed to continue to survive into the 21st century. If it is still an idea today, how is it an idea that is still in circulation? This is a story, as I've suggested, of cultural twinning, of course, of cultural exchange and cultural sharing and rapprochement, but it is also at times a story of cultural warfare, of cultural appropriation. And it is actually on a battlefield that I very briefly want to start my talk today, namely the battlefields of the First World War, and a really rather startling invocation of Shakespeare in the trenches, a situation in which at times both the British and the Germans were called to arms to fight the battles of World War I in the name of the Bard. Here in the trenches, we get this remarkable image of how, really only just over 100 years ago, Shakespeare was still inhabiting this position as both the British and the German national poet. One German soldier in particular, called Hans Hecht, is, for example, recorded as exhorting his fellow Germans to fight the British precisely to preserve the sanctity of that German national poet, William Shakespeare. Here's what Hecht said. Germany has no bitterer foe than the descendants of our poet Shakespeare, yet even amongst her soldiers there is not one that would belittle his glory. We believe that we Germans are truer heirs to Shakespeare's genius than his own compatriots who have betrayed their cousins in blood for the sake of material gain. Now, in his battle cry, Hecht is both continuing a tradition deeply rooted in German culture of appropriating Shakespeare through claims of spiritual affinity, but also suggests something more. He suggests that the British have increasingly become unworthy guardians of Shakespeare's legacy. So Shakespeare here is not simply being appropriated as a fellow German, so as German in spirit, or in Geist, as the word was used in the 19th century, but increasingly being used in a form of cultural warfare, which identifies the British as in terminal cultural decline, and the Germans as the true guardians, not just of Shakespeare, but I think by extension of European cultural heritage. Now, Hecht is a problematic figure, and he redevelops this self-same argument during the era of National Socialism. But if we stay in the period of World War I, well, this German appropriation of Shakespeare in the trenches did not go unnoticed in Britain, where forces also mobilised, in part to protect Shakespeare, I suppose, but basically to use him as a tool of cultural warfare as well. There is some really remarkable and quite horrifying nationalistic rhetoric underpinning the annual Shakespeare lecture to the British Academy held in 1918. It was held by a man called Sir Walter Raleigh, not that Sir Walter Raleigh, obviously, in which he talks about Shakespeare's The Tempest, a play that nowadays we tend to see in kind of a colonial, post-colonial mode. In that play, he takes the figure of Caliban and turns him into a German. So there is Sir Walter Raleigh, and this is what he says. Caliban becomes a German, Fritz, the Boche, a bestial, savage, deformed slave. And in this speech, the dominance of Prospero's English over Caliban's German is something that he stresses and is very palpable. So there's an interesting emphasis here on language and the inability of the Germans to really ever truly access or indeed appropriate Shakespeare because they don't speak English. Other responses, like that of the author Arthur Quiller Couch, are less directly jingoistic in tone, I suppose, but also focus on this issue of language. So Quiller Couch wrote at the same time, these men, the Germans, do honestly believe our Shakespeare, whose language they cannot speak, cannot write, can but imperfectly understand, that our Shakespeare's spirit has migrated, in other words, migrated to Germany. And again, the focus on language here in these British responses in World War I is, I think, a subtle but distinctive shift away from what the Germans are saying at this time, where at least in Germany the issue is superficially expressed in terms of a kind of civilizing role in Europe and preserving Shakespeare's values, whereas the British are mostly concerned about issues of language and, I suppose, the translatability or not of Shakespeare. For the purposes of thinking about the Anglo-German encounter then, this skirmish in the First World War over Shakespeare and European cultural heritage as played out against the trenches is of significance for several reasons. It reveals, for instance, the strains that are placed on local or national appropriations of author figures when they enter into transnational circulation. The British claims on Shakespeare demonstrate, for instance, the extent to which British scholars were already aware by World War I that Shakespeare was no longer their exclusive national property. It reveals an anxiety about this, in fact. Their attempts to protect Shakespeare from the Germans can be read as just one part of an increasingly futile effort to uphold a local myth of the purely British bard. But similarly, for the Germans, the wartime debate over the local myth of Unser Shakespeare, projected centuries of internal Shakespeare appropriation into a wider framework than ever before, ultimately questioning the legitimacy of this idea of Unser Shakespeare by pitching it against a much more pluralistic vision, what one Shakespeare translator has called the reality of mein, dein, sein, unser, euer, ihr Shakespeare. The extraterritorial space of warfare thus places pressure on these territorially defined, these nationally defined stories of Shakespeare, either as the bard or Unser Shakespeare. They come and they clash. For the rest of my talk then, I want to look at how Shakespeare's status as a German national poet has been challenged, but also sustained. And I particularly want to turn my attention in the second half of my talk to the 20th century. I'll first, though, consider some of the mechanisms that have supported Shakespeare's journey across the two countries over the past couple of hundred years. And in particular, I want to touch upon translation, since language seems to be such a crucial issue here. But I also want to think not only of linguistic translation, but also cultural translation, the way in which not just words, but also practices, particular modes of theatre travel across borders and are translated as they enter into new countries and contexts. I'll also, in that part of my talk, focus on another big German name, Bertolt Brecht, because Brecht becomes a key interlocutor, not only between Germany and Shakespeare, but he also becomes a way in which a Germanized Shakespeare begins to go global. And then finally, I'll turn to some recent stagings of Shakespeare, perhaps stagings of Shakespeare that you will have had the chance to see yourself. One of those was within the Globe to Globe Festival at Shakespeare's Globe back in 2012 as part of the Cultural Olympiad, and one of them was more recent in London at Barbican, Thomas Ostermeyer's production of Hamlet. I'm interested in how such stagings of Shakespeare both celebrate his interculturality, his Britishness, his Germanness, but also awaken all the cultural anxieties that come when he travels across borders. During the 2012 World Shakespeare Festival, British audiences were granted greater than ever access to a range of global performance traditions and interpretations of Shakespeare, not just those from Germany. I was very lucky to be part of the team that assessed that festival critically, and what became clear during that project was that it wasn't just the different languages being spoken that caused British audiences problems with this global Shakespeare. Indeed, surtitles were used throughout, and so you could always follow the action of what was happening on stage. Instead, one of the biggest hurdles that seemed to be problematic for audiences were the non-naturalistic theatrical practices and often irreverent approaches to the text used by these productions. These shows from around the world became foreign in a double sense. Yes, because of the linguistic issues posed by translation, but also because of a performative difference rooted in a range of cultural traditions different to those of the British host. And a colleague of mine, Christy Carson at Royal Holloway, has written really extensively about this. This double foreignness, though, is significant for the development and circulation of the German idea of Unser Shakespeare too, because it points out to us an important shift in the German Shakespeare story. So it marks a move away from an early version of that story, where questions of language and fidelity were still highly significant for the Germans, and that's largely a 19th century story, and to one where contemporary Germany, Germany today, is frequently held as one of those countries where Shakespeare seems to have a reputation without his language, as the translator Ton Hunsler has said. Now that might seem an odd phrase. What can it possibly mean? Shakespeare having a reputation without his language. Well, what Hunsler is pointing out there is that the translation of Shakespeare is a booming business in Germany, with a proliferation of new translations embedded centrally in performance practice, with each new translation often an integral part of a production's creative process, rather than as existing as a separate literary entity. So I think the way to think about this is that although Germany actually translates Shakespeare more every single year than any other country in the world, this isn't resulting in multiple iterations of Hamlet available in your bookshop. Rather, when a production company or a director decides to do their Hamlet or King Lear or Much Ado or whatever it is, they commission their own new translations, which they then adapt, change, rip apart, and glue back together to become their own new version of the play. Now, some translators, such as the Danish translator of Shakespeare, Niels Brunzer, sees this as a really positive feature of the German landscape, that it's a source of exceptional creativity in the kind of constant retranslation and thus making constantly alive of Shakespeare's works. Others, however, have been a little bit more suspicious, including a very famous, wonderful translator, Mike Hamburger, who has warned against what he called Germany's manifold hodgepodge of Shakespearean translations, adaptations, interpretations, variations, and offshoots. That is to say, a translation practice that is actually in some ways rooted in a lack of interest in linguistic fidelity. And I suppose here we're touching on the fundamental difference between translation and adaptation. And there are many things that happen in Germany that are called translations of Shakespeare, but I think here in the UK, we would only ever term adaptations. This explosion in contemporary translations of Shakespeare in Germany marks both a continuation and a departure from the German tradition. So if we go back in time to the 19th century, it marks a move away from, for instance, the monolithic dominance of the Schlegel-Tieck rendition of Shakespeare, which was actually just one of many that were undertaken in the 19th century, but which has taken up an almost mythical position in German cultural history, and which is often used and was used at the time to support this idea that Shakespeare was a spiritually German national poet. The idea was that if these translations by these romantic poets into German of Shakespeare were as beautiful as they were, this must surely indicate that on some level Shakespeare was a German, or at least, as said, spiritually German. I should also point out that the Schlegel-Tieck edition was not simply the production of these two men. There was a very large team of people around them, including a great number of female translators, including one of their wives, who sadly have been written out of the literary discourse around this translation effort. It is an extraordinary translation effort, but it came to dominate the scene in Germany. So against this, we have contemporary retranslation as a constant process. And that's something that at the beginning of the 20th century, another Shakespearean scholar, Friedrich Gundolf, claimed in a book called Shakespeare and the German Spirit, so there we have that key term of Geist again, as something very crucial to the longevity of Germany's appropriation of Shakespeare. He says that the translation of Shakespeare into German is the rebirth of Shakespeare as a German verbal cosmos. And thus, constant retranslation is a way of constantly reappropriating Shakespeare and indicating this key spiritual relationship between Shakespeare's works and the German nation. Now, that's one side of this story, the linguistic side of the story. But as I've already hinted, equally significant is a further form of translation, the translation of performance practice, because it's not only language, it's also aesthetics that circulate transnationally and which can be appropriated and translated into new contexts, often then in that process coming into conflict with indigenous norms. So what do I mean by this? Well, if we think about British Shakespeare for a moment, it tends to, and this is a colleague of mine called Agneta Manchevich that I'm quoting here, it tends to fall back on a quasi-Elizabethan mode of dramatic performance, focusing on speech delivery and character development. And if you've been to see something at the RSC, you will notice their emphasis on the language. And then if you get the language of Shakespeare right, then you can understand what's going on. And if you've been to the Globe, a wonderful theatre that attempts to think about what early modern theatre practice really was like, you also often see productions in this mode. This is, however, a tradition that stands in direct contrast to contemporary German Shakespeare, which is often stylized as anti-illusionic and lacking in fidelity. In short, German Shakespeare in the theatre is radical, whereas British Shakespeare in the theatre tends to be conventional. So we have this clash too, not only between the two languages, but also between these two performance traditions. Now, a really key figure in the development and circulation of Germany's reputation for radical Shakespearean performance was Bertolt Brecht, as I've said. Brecht was perhaps the most influential German playwright and thinker about theatre in the 20th century, and his theatrical aesthetic and vocabulary profoundly reshaped modern European and modern world theatre practice. And I'm quite certain that if you've ever been to the theatre, you'll have seen something deeply influenced by Brecht, either in its content, its politics, or its staging, even if that wasn't a play by Brecht himself. Devoid of illusion, non-cathartic, and transforming that notion of theatrical performance that should move us or entertain us into one of theatrical interrogation, where we should be prompted to some form of action by our experience of the theatre. Brecht's was a dialectical, political theatre whose most famous concept in German is called Verfremdung, in English, alienation. And this notion of alienation is that theatrical experience should open up a critical space between the production on the stage and the audience watching it. A space not just for discourse, so not just for emotion or laughter or tears or entertainment. On the contrary, those should be subverted so that we then move into a mode of political action by our response to the theatre. Now, Brecht was a political radical. He was working in a Marxist framework. And so perhaps it's a little bit surprising to also know that Brecht was obsessed with Shakespeare. And this is why he's such a crucial part of this story of Germany's love affair with Shakespeare. Brecht engaged with Shakespeare's works more than any other author. And in doing so, he provided a platform for the wider dissemination of the idea of unser Shakespeare than ever before. What I mean by that is this. Brecht not only theorized what unser Shakespeare might mean in new and innovative ways, he also did it in a theatrical language, so the language of his theatre of alienation, of his epic theatre, that ultimately crossed borders and found corollaries in other national theatrical traditions. And simultaneously, the persona of Brecht too aided this, inasmuch as he becomes a vehicle for his concept of German Shakespeare to travel. So Brecht is forced into exile during the period of National Socialism. He moves both to Scandinavia and to America. And this allows, in turn, his radical stance on Shakespeare to spread amongst an international and not merely a local audience. That Brecht's approach to Shakespeare was also iconoclastic, involving the significant remodelling of Shakespeare, he calls it the Ummontierung of Shakespeare, only added further force to German Shakespeare's increasingly transnational reputation as transgressive. And so while in the 19th century its reputation predominantly lay in the field of translation, in the 20th century this reputation goes global and becomes associated with theatrical radicalism. Now, Brecht's most famous expression of this transgression is in a question that he posed. And this is the question he asked: can we change Shakespeare? To which he, perhaps unsurprisingly given what I've just said, responded with a firm yes. For Brecht, altering or indeed entirely refashioning Shakespeare is not an act of sacrilege, as it is sometimes even today seen in the UK context. Brecht claimed that it wasn't sacrilegious since the plays themselves owe their existence to sacrilege. What does Brecht mean by this? Well, really, Brecht was quite a knowledgeable early modernist in terms of his understanding of how theatre worked at this time, and he's referring directly to the conditions of the original creation, transcription, and subsequent cultural codification of Shakespeare's works. Essentially, he's arguing that Shakespeare, from day one, was nothing more than a cultural construct. The point he's really gesturing at is, of course, that the first folio, so the version that we consistently return to of Shakespeare's works, was only produced in 1623, but that was 7 years after Shakespeare's death in 1616. So what happens in that 7 years between Shakespeare dying and this first kind of writing up of all the plays? Because of this gap, Brecht believed, Shakespeare wasn't an author in the sort of modern sense that we might have, but rather more of a cipher, a source of raw material. And that raw material could then be mined for a new dramaturgy, for an epic theatre. He's essentially arguing that for Shakespeare to remain contemporary and relevant, we need to step away from some of our concerns about fidelity and start playing around with him a little bit more. Now, given the political nature of epic theatre, it's perhaps unsurprising that Brecht felt Shakespeare required quite significant updating to mean anything in the modern world. And one of his most famous suggestions was a rereading of Hamlet in view of the dark and bloody time that I am writing. And at that moment in time, he was writing in 1949. Thomas Mann also thought about Hamlet and Germany at this moment in time, asking Germany to undertake the sort of self-introspective questioning that Hamlet does in Shakespeare's play. And this tradition of Germany associating itself as a nation with Hamlet is something that indeed stretches way back into the early 19th century. But this act of historicising Shakespeare, of, on the one hand, profoundly understanding the period and the time that the text was produced in, so the early modern period, but then comparing and contrasting it with the current moment of its performance and really using that productive tension as the means with which to generate energy for production, was central to Brecht's interrogative and dialectical method. Particularly problematic for Brecht then were Shakespeare's tragic heroes, those ones that we fate so much in this country. And this is because those characters were by definition unepic, by which I mean they could not change as they were the playthings of fate. An epic theatre demands that we are able to change. For Shakespeare's iconic heroes to change then, the plays around them also had to change, and thus the great process of Brecht's restructuring of Shakespeare begins, motivated equally by political, as I've said, essentially Marxist, but also aesthetic aims. Now, this is a very complicated story on one level, but I think for our purposes today, this is the crucial point. When Brecht refuses to bow to the dominance of Shakespeare, the icon, and instead almost kind of turns back to Shakespeare and demands that Shakespeare serve the needs of Brecht's own epic theatre, a significant shift takes place in the German love affair with Shakespeare. Away, as I've said, from translation and language as the primary ways through which Shakespeare could become a German, so that Schlegeltique story, which ultimately is really addressing an internal local audience of German speakers within Germany, and turns it towards a much more internationally minded story, rooted in the language of performance, by which German Shakespeare is actually then able to go global and have impact in countries beyond Germany and beyond the UK. Forever linked with Brecht's iconoclasm, the idea of a radical German Shakespeare had found in Brecht a figure in which it could truly become a transnational phenomenon. The echoes of this radicalism can still be felt today. And during the Globe to Globe Festival, for example, Germany was represented by this production of Timon of Athens by the Bremer Shakespeare Company. Audiences walking into the Globe Theatre were greeted first by this message plastered over every single door. Warning, this production contains male nudity. Before even seeing anything of the production then, even just in the foyer, the reception of this show was being shaped by an expectation of a certain transgressive performance tradition for German studies. And certainly, as a German theatre studies scholar, seeing this sign for me meant only one thing: the Germans must be in town. Because this notion that if you put a German on the stage, they're going to take off their clothes has become almost one of the ultimate cliches for what radical German theatre might be. Of course, it's not true, but it's what has stuck, particularly in the Anglophone world. Reviews of this production noted that it was more of a translation, adaptation, rather than a faithful rendition. So we have the return to this dynamic between fidelity and adaptation, and that it presented an irreverent approach to the text, with few speeches left intact. Most of the play was paraphrased. And in this way, actually, Timon appears to confirm and uphold those twin underpinnings of contemporary German Shakespeare I've basically been outlining: linguistic infidelity and performative radicalism. Linguistically, the company behind the production, the Bremer Shakespeare Company, as I've said, strongly evoked a Brechtian notion of mining the original for contemporary meaning in their approach to the translation. They stated that their new translation was designed to present Shakespeare, the popular realist contemporary playwright, in all his rich contradictory variety. Indeed, the translation of the Bremer Shakespeare Company was very free indeed, both in modern German and in prose, not in verse. The radicalism of their translation, or adaptation, if you wish, was similarly mirrored in their performance style. They claimed they deliberately rejected theatrical illusion in favour of a staging that was fairly bare or non-realistic. And essentially, they followed many kind of Brechtian dictates in their staging, employing gestus, tableau, and song to alienate the audience, and perhaps more importantly, using that to refocus the drama on a contemporary political choice between art and commerce. So they understood the early modern roots, but they did precisely this Brechtian thing of making it speak to the present and exploring the tensions between those two elements. As a result, many contemporary references littered this version of Timon that, of course, you won't find in the original. Timon's problems with liquidity, so he goes bankrupt, were utterly modern, and he has some very famous cynicism at the start of Act 4 in the play, which in this version was retargeted at bankers, bonuses, pensions, and the stock exchange. Remember, this is 2012, so we're just in the aftermath of the global financial crash and the Euro crisis of 2008. When Timon extols in the play the virtue of friendship over money, he is absolutely remaining close to something that's in the Shakespearean original. But in this version, he then adds a bitter afterthought: let the Greeks come now, and in that moment, the production then plays on a whole range of other political connotations, not least the fact that we are watching Germans performing a work about a Greek financial crisis in a theatre that is very close to the heart of London's financial sector at precisely the height of the Euro crisis. And at a moment, 2012, when Germany's own relationship with Greece was under particular strain and effigies of Angela Merkel were being burned in Athens. The notion then of a German reappropriation of Shakespeare was thus in no way challenged when Timon of Athens came back to the Globe stage, which in a way we could see as a kind of mythical home for Shakespeare. They didn't tone it down, in other words, for this act of homecoming. Indeed, on the contrary, they seemed to increase their radicalism, at the end of the play even exhorting the audience to burn down the Globe and replace it with a bank as, after all, Another bank is exactly what London needs. A phrase dripping, of course, in irony. Now, this final line about burning down the globe and replacing it with a bank was added for the London performances of the play, and so it's absent both from the original translation and from the recordings of the performances in Germany. And thus, this seems to me to be of particular significance when thinking about the Anglo-German relationship that's filtered through Shakespeare. Of course, we can, simply dismiss this demand to burn down the globe as a quick jibe or as a glancing contemporary allusion to financial crisis. But I think we should also read it more broadly as an act of resistance by the Germans, a refusal to see the Globe to Globe Festival as an easy or natural homecoming for German Shakespeare. Rather than reinscribing Bankside in London as the true site of Shakespearean performance, or indeed Britain as Shakespeare's home, the Germans took full possession of the globe space with their production. They took full possession of Shakespeare's language through their translation, only to then at the very end of this experience disown it by threatening to destroy the globe once again through fire. And crucially, in addressing these moments to members of the audience who only spoke German, because these additional phrases were ad-libbed on the night and thus not translated in the surtitles, the Germans were displacing English speakers as the expert spectators of Shakespeare and expert spectators of Globe. In doing so, the Bremen Shakespeare Company fundamentally refused to release Shakespeare back into the hands of the British through what might otherwise have been seen as a symbolic return of Germany's Shakespeare to his home theatre. Now, similar things happen in my final example too, and that is a show that, again, maybe some of you have seen. The play is Hamlet, the setting is the Barbican, the year is 2011. Here is a quick review of that production. Lars Eidinger, playing the title role, emerges among the audience, clamouring through the stalls with malcontent energy. He stumbles across the backs of seats, railing and joshing, until suddenly smacking his head on a concrete joist jutting out above him. He yowls in pain. Some people gasp and offer help, others giggle nervously. "I'm hurt," Eidinger whines. "And you're laughing?" Directed by Thomas Ostermeier, the German artistic director of the Schaubühne Theatre in Berlin, this Hamlet, described here by David Jays, has become something of a contemporary touchstone for the modern German appropriation of Shakespeare. Although long established in Germany and elsewhere in the world, premiering in Athens in 2009 and with over 200 performances globally and over 160,000 people seeing it outside of Germany, its performance in the Barbican in London in 2011 became a major cause célèbre because of its supposed transgression. Jay himself admitted that he had to ask friends who'd seen a different version of the show during the run whether Eidinger's accident had been genuine or whether it was yet another carefully choreographed moment in a production which had already been full of the unexpected, including a stage deep in soil and food fights to Godspeed You Black Emperor on the soundtrack. In many ways, Jay's account of Ostermeier's Hamlet reinforces so many of the features commonly associated with contemporary German Shakespeare. The scenography should be anti-illusionic, the sound design should mix diegetic and non-diegetic sounds to alienating effect, and there should definitely be some mud, and if you're really lucky, there will be nudity in the mud too. And actually, just to return to this point, it is Eidinger, this actor, that has been really fundamental in creating this cliche of the actor rolling around naked in mud being the ultimate piece of German transgression, because rather infamously, he does seem to do it in every single production, regardless of what role he is playing. Now, Ostermeyer, the director himself, has noted the particular energy that the Barbican performances of his Hamlet had, with the shift to the London stage, here again representing the home of Shakespeare, resulting in the production becoming even more iconoclastic than he had originally conceived. So this increase in iconoclasm is not simply the result of a shift in reception, although I think that has something to do with it. British audiences and critics are perhaps predestined to be more scandalised by alterations to the national poet. A couple of years ago, there was a Hamlet with Benedict Cumberbatch, I think also at the Barbican, in which they changed the position of to be or not to be in the show, and literally people dissolved into pools of anxiety. Well, if you think that was bad, wait until you see a Thomas Ostermeyer version of the play. Ostermeyer describes how Eidinger seemed to go berserk in the London premiere, how he ended up running into the audience, climbing on the backrests, ripping up the notebook from the hands of the critic from The Guardian. Utter madness. Indeed, referring directly to the moment that the earlier critic Jay found so striking, Ostermeyer details how Eidinger's rampage culminated with the actor playing Hamlet cracking his head against a concrete pillar. Far from being carefully choreographed moments then, these were examples of what Ostermeyer calls Eidinger's performance intoxication when playing Hamlet at home. After Hamlet premiered in London, Ostermeyer was actually offered the artistic directorship of the Royal Shakespeare Company, a moment that would not just have indicated the Anglo-German twinning of our two countries, but the institutionalization of the Anglo-German relationship, and perhaps the ultimate expression of unser Shakespeare still being successful and still being a dominant force in the 21st century. Although Ostermeyer rejected the position, the very fact that he, as a German, had been considered for a role designed, in his own words, to care for our national saint, reveals the extent to which he had become an international personality in the theatre world, and the extent to which that was also due to his iconoclastic take on Shakespeare. Ostermeyer has really worked very hard to achieve this position, pushing also for an extensive internationalization agenda for German theatre, whilst leading the Berlin-based Schaubühne, identifying in particular an emerging market for the export of a specifically radical German theatrical tradition. With us, he says, the international festivals buy Berlin identity, he notes. In other words, he says, they buy the hippest avant-garde. What might be termed the Ostermeyer brand of theatre then guarantees something that on the one hand is specifically German, mud, nudity, loud music, but one that can also circulate relatively easily globally. It's a transgressive performance aesthetic, at once political, but crucially not too political, radical, but not too radical. Essentially, as Anita Mantovich has said, the application of a Brecht-like type of aesthetics, yet without that Marxist agenda. For many people, Ostermeyer and radical German Shakespeare has become what German theatre is abroad. And like Brecht before him, this double act of both moving as an individual around the world, but also creating a performance aesthetic that travels across borders, has been the key vehicle for providing the idea of a radical German Shakespeare continued visibility and transnational mobility, essential for that nation's sustainability. So to conclude, the Shakespeare scholars Clara Calvo and Tom Hunslas have noted how by the middle of the First World War, Shakespeare had already become the object of scrutiny between nations, an international phenomenon, an item of European heritage to be argued over, used and abused within both national and European discourse. This Shakespeare, so the Shakespeare I opened my talk with today, was never really a national author in the first place. Rather, it was precisely Shakespeare's ability to function as a cipher for contemporary cultural projections that was key. Utterly malleable, this Shakespeare could be Shakespeare the Patriot for both the English and the Germans in the trenches, Shakespeare the Radical, or Shakespeare really whatever you want him to be. Of course, In the German context, the love affair was powered by translation, and in that sense it was easy for German Shakespeare to be seen as transgressive. After all, the very act of translation could be seen as an act of transgression. Certainly some of those early critics in the UK felt that way, a move away from the original language, which in the British performance tradition has been so pivotal. There's a wonderful former head of the RSC, John Barton, who believed that if you dig into the text, Shakespeare himself will start to direct you. But that notion, so critical to our tradition here of Shakespeare, is fundamentally challenged by the more radical adaptations and free translations common in Germany. What I've argued should really be seen as kind of double translation simultaneously of both language and performance, which is at the heart of what makes Shakespeare German. The Anglo-German encounter with Shakespeare then has looped through internalizing processes of translating and claiming Shakespeare as German through a language, a story primarily aimed at a German local audience in the 19th century, but also in the 20th century shot right back out into the world as part of a radical performance practice which Germany is now exporting all over the globe, including back to the UK, thus starting that process of Anglo-German cultural encounter all over again. When the Germans claim that Shakespeare is German, then I don't see an absurd claim, but rather a real insight into how Shakespeare has become what Husserl calls a transcultural myth in perpetual motion. This, in my view, is key to Shakespeare's longevity. His position as a cultural icon is partly founded by his position as a cultural cipher that is precisely sustained through its circulation in the European and global cultural economy, a circulation for which the German love affair with Shakespeare provides us with such an intriguing case. Well, thank you very much for watching, and thank you again to Barbara and all the team at the Guildford Twinning Association for giving me the opportunity to talk today.